Yeah, we're good.
Roles and responsibilities. So this will come up in plan and then extend into execute a bit. The idea is when you're creating your plan, now you're getting down to detailed tasks, you are deciding who's going to do those tasks. So who's becoming your larger team for execute, be it volunteer A or volunteer B or somebody with expertise. You are deciding. And what you want to do is clearly define what they're going to do. So you can see in the cartoon, I don't think they've had a good conversation about who's going to do what. They just started doing, and the other guys are like, yeah, just let them do it. So, where they could have, efficiently, so the idea of having clear roles and responsibilities, the last bullet, enables effective and timely decision making and efficient amount of work. So when people are very clear. The example I like best, and I don't know if everybody watches the sport of race car driving, but if you think about, at least think about a pit stop, NASCAR, you see the commercials and the car pulls up and they do the tires. You don't want 5 people doing the right side of the tires with nobody doing the left side. When those cars come up and they do the pit stop, everybody knows exactly what they're going to do, and they do it without communication, they do it without thinking, they just do. That's the ultimate to me, or river rafting. Equally, it's a boat, it's moving, when it's going well, everybody's rolling forward and it's going super smooth because everybody knows their role on that raft, where they're supposed to paddle, and somebody's kind of yelling it out to you. But the idea of a well-oiled machine, everybody knows what they're supposed to do. There's no overlap, there's no gap, there's no duplicate of effort, there's no somebody standing around going, gosh, I don't know what I'm supposed to do. Everybody knows what they do and they just do it. That's the ultimate goal. It's a hard to achieve goal, and I've seen teams achieve it for short periods of time and then lose it. So that's why I say this carries into execute. When you create a plan, you want to be very clear on who's doing what, make sure they're not separate, they're not overlapped, etc. And then you want to kind of keep reminding them along the way and refine it along the way. So this will become important later. You also want to allow for flexibility later on. So you may have clear roles and responsibilities, somebody gets sick. Now you're going to have to adjust that. So you're constantly watching it, making sure people are clear about what they want to do, and that's all that means there. Then I have 2 slides on change management. And it's just a reminder to you all to remember that when you're doing something, anything, there is an aspect of change for which you should actually consciously manage for. And recognize that if somebody's going through a change, that they have to accept that change, and human nature is to push back and say, I don't know, I don't like that idea. First thing is, not my idea, so I don't like it. So part of your role as a project manager is to help people through that change. So I think, do you pronounce your name, Sudha? You had mentioned early on, what if I come up with an idea for which they hadn't thought of or they don't like? Now the first reaction is probably like, I don't know, that's something new and different, right? And your role is to recognize that is a natural reaction and then help them through that. Both, and I should have brought it up also in the initiate stage as well, because that's the way in which you can have that conversation. But they are going to have, there's this whole people factor aspect to it. It's not just the tasks, it's the people. It's the people accepting the tasks. It's the people wanting to do the tasks. It's the people who are the recipients and your stakeholders. It's just natural for them to be apprehensive to change. So recognize that and kind of help them along. Sometimes I have tasks in my plan that specifically focus on managing change. Communication, the more I talk to people, advertising, marketing, those kind of items can really help people along, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So it has just different, these are kind of like, that's the way we've always done it, we don't want to change. Natural reaction. Don't let it stop you. If it's the right thing to do to move forward, then help the people move through the change, but recognize it's happening so you don't get freaked out by it. So that's what this slide shows you, is the change curve. Has anybody ever seen this before? You have. Yes, you have. So this is, for any change, this is what people do. This is a psychological kind of aspect of people are first unaware of the change, have no clue what's going on around them. Then they become aware. So I was trying to think of a volunteer example. In this case, maybe it's somebody's painting a mural on a wall. So they're all of a sudden aware. Did you hear they're going to paint a mural across the street from my wonder what that's going to look like. Then they go into this thing called the Valley of Despair. So they say, I hear, and then it's uh-oh. A lot of times this is the case when people don't understand or don't have the information, so they create fear or they create their own understanding. I don't know, it might not be attractive, this mural, or it might have graffiti on it, or I don't, so they get all kind of worked out. They have to get through, everybody has to go through that Valley of Despair. It's how fast they go through it. It might be 5 minutes, it might be 3 days, it might be 3 months. And the goal of the project manager is to be aware that people, stakeholders, recipients of your projects may have to go through a little bit of this to recognize and be comfortable with the change, and you want to help them along. Help them go through a little faster. So in the case of the mural, it may be, I don't know, I don't think I'll like it. Well, maybe I'll like it. It might be that fast. It might be 5 minutes for somebody to go through that, but they are going to go through that before they get to the point of understanding. Oh, I understand what's going on now. I see what they're trying to achieve. Typically, there's been a communication aspect in that, from awareness. It's the why. Remember in Initiate, we talked about the importance of why for your team members. You may spring on them a new change. Well, I don't know, I don't think I like that change. I don't think that's a good change. It's the why aspect. Bring everybody to the why, communicate, share lots of information about the plan, about what you're trying to achieve. Will help them get through that faster. And then they go into accept, and then they actually like it. Ah, that's a great idea. I'm so happy they're doing that. And if you watch people, you'll see them do this on any kind of change. And simply just note that, look for it, recognize, oh, I see they're going through this. Let me see if I can help them get to the other side. Okay. If you want more information, there might be some more information that we can share kind of offline as reading material, as opposed to talk. Right now, it's just simply recognize and be aware of it. Any questions on making the plan? We'll go through the timeline at the end. I think that will be, can I get the door?
Oh yeah, sorry.
Okay, you get, thank you. I think making the plan, to me, making the plan is one of the funnest aspects, because again, it's kind of like a puzzle. I think it's the most daunting of the 4. Because when you're in the throes of it, execute, I actually like teaching the most, because it's where the action is, right? But where the plan is a lot of thinking, it's a lot of drawing, but it's quite artistic in going through it. And if you think of it that way, then it's usually not so daunting.
So when do you decide, like, okay, I'm done with planning, I'm going to start doing it? Like,
You could plan forever.
Because, like, as you go on, there could be, like, new things that you never thought of, and
Yes.
you want to incorporate that into plan. So isn't planning something you would, like, sort of revisit every now and then?
You do. I mean, the idea is your plan 100% at the start? No. The plan is enough. It's more than enough to get, I would say enough to get started, because you want to have it fairly well thought out. So, I forget, somebody asked me early on about the question of sharing the plan. Do I get yelled at, for giving, or does my client get mad at me for saying, no, you can't do that in 3 months. You really need 6 months to do that. I state with my plan kind of a confidence factor. Very early on, I might draft something up and go, well, this is kind of a plan, and I only feel about 50% confident in this thing. I have so much more work to do before I can actually start executing on this plan. It's a point in which you want to start bringing in team members to execute. You don't need to be at 100% confidence level. In fact, you never will be at 100% confidence level on your plan, but maybe 80% confident before you start bringing in. So you need enough that you can clearly articulate to people that you're going to bring in to execute as to what they're doing and make sure that that's going to fit. So it can't be an idea, but it'll never be 100%. So, but you may have like the first half of the plan really solid and the second half of the plan is still in planning. And that's okay too. But again, it's about having people who can execute and being able to tell them what they need to do, why they need to do it, how it fits into the big picture, and make sure that what they do is indeed part of the end result. It's a bit of gut instinct, so because I didn't answer your question, and I think project management as a whole is a lot of art as opposed to science. And there is a bit of gut instinct to say, I think we have enough to go. You could be wrong, and then you're going to pay the price on issues and risks. We're going to talk about that. Yes?
So how much, if any, research goes into creating a plan?
research in what I would call the initiate stage, or I call it sometimes discovery. Let's go do a discovery phase, and let's do a lot of research. And I might, in fact, I'm dealing with this right now in my current project, because they're not really sure. Like, we were given a project, so please go create this dashboard. And they're not positive yet that they're ready for that. Well, let's step back and let's just do discovery, and let's make a plan for just discovery. So, for example, in your case, you're doing a business plan. Not actually executing on the plan yet, right? So you're having a plan to make a plan, and that's okay. And then you'll have a plan to execute on the plan after that, if that makes sense. And in the beginning, to do research, your plan is not going to be about executing on putting the taco truck in place. It's going to be, your plan is about creating the business plan, if that makes sense.
Right,
So part of your plan is research, right? It's going to have a component of research,
right.
where you're going to have tasks associated with research. Is that where you're
Right.
thinking?
I'm just trying to think about specifically where I would start researching, like, but for example, if I don't know if there's expertise in a certain field, then I would be researching what expertise there is to make my plan more concrete or,
Right.
you know what I mean?
And that's going to be a task on your plan, research.
What's the task on my plan?
Yeah.
So
this
most
is-
of the plan is, sounds like brainstorming.
In your case, it might be brainstorm in this area and then fill in details on rest of task. Because sometimes you don't know what you need to do until you do that research.
Yeah.
Yeah, and in the case of what you're trying to achieve as a business plan, you may have investigate 3 avenues, decide next steps,
Okay.
fill in next steps here. The trick is in that case, when you're in that kind of a little bit more nebulous state, having clear communication about that end date, because you don't know. There's a way of doing software development, I was just talking about a friend today, called Agile, in which you iterate quite a bit, do a little bit, revisit the plan, do a little bit more, visit the plan and the requirements, do a little bit more. So your whole project from initiate to close is of course of a week, and then you repeat it, it's rinse and repeat clearly over and over before you get to the whole end result. The trick at that is you don't quite know when you're done because you don't know how many iterations it's going to take. And it's really important in that case to communicate how much you do know and how much you don't know of your plan, so people don't get locked on your end date just because you've set a date, and then you miss it because you discovered something in your research phase that articulated a bunch of other items. So you might set many milestones along the way to say, we're going to focus on researching this component, and that may open 3 other avenues, but let's just focus on this first. And here's my mini milestone to be complete on that before announcing kind of the big bang milestone. Okay.
So when you're drawing up this plan, you're initiating, you draw up the plan, give to them, it's okay that it's open-ended then for a close date?
With a confidence. You do want to set some sort of expectation. I think it'll be July, but my confidence is
You
pretty
want to be
low.
able to go to them and say, we're going to reevaluate the key points, go
Yeah.
back and reevaluate, but this is what we see.
This is what
as
we're
a
currently
possibility.
seeing, and here's the assumptions I need to validate before I can tell you clearly.
Okay.
So in the case of where there's a lot of research involved, here's what I don't know, and therefore, so we haven't yet talked about risks, but we're going to talk about, here's what I don't know, and the risk of not knowing those is that the plan could be extended as a result. I like to frame it up in terms of risk because then they clearly understand you know what you know today, but there is quite a risk that you could learn more later that could influence the plan. So we're actually going to jump into that section, and then let's come back and frame it in that way. Before we do that, who has neighborhood house? Hi. So I was going to ask you to envision back to here what you might have to overcome from a change perspective.
Okay.
And
So-
first 2 to 3 sentences in your project.
Our project is working with a neighborhood house. It's a low-income community, and space, they might not be too happy with that at first.
That could be if you're adding something to what somebody does, sometimes that is you're gonna make me do more work. Sometimes that is a change.
Right,
And then they'll be like, oh, okay, I see why. That's a good thing. I don't mind doing that.
Yeah, or even like, oh, my kid heard about this environmental education program. They really want to do it, but gosh, I don't want to have to take them to it or things
Yeah,
like that.
yeah. There's always that, oh, okay,
Yeah.
that impact of. Thank you. Thanks. So, and we had you joined. I'm Carol, by the way. Hi. And hi.
Hi, I'm Matt.
Welcome. You joined about the time we finished up Initiate, I think. So we were doing the 4 phases of a project: initiate, and then plan, execute, and then close. So that kind of gives you kind of an overview, and I'm happy to talk to you at the end on the areas that you guys missed at all. So, but I wanted to welcome you since I hadn't really done. Okay, so we are going to move to plan. Like I said, plan's kind of where the action is. Plan is all do. Plan, execute, yes. It's the end of the day. Everybody's been working all day. So the idea of plan is do. Now we've talked a little bit, or execute is do, but we have talked about sometimes you don't have all the answers to your plan, so sometimes you're also doing some planning as you go. So plan the work, and then work the plan. So you've created this plan, now you want to work it. So on this particular slide, a lot of execute is the flurry of getting things done, but we mentioned earlier on, and you all told me, one of the values of project managers is to have somebody looking at the plan, looking for how's it going, are we getting our stuff done, while everybody else is deep in the weeds in their tasks. And that's what this slide says, is to remind as a project manager, sometimes it's easy for me to get caught up in what's going wrong, what needs to be fixed, but just to remember a cadence of working my plan, looking at my plan. How's it going? Do I have all the tasks? Did I miss something? Looking ahead. So when I actually took some driver training, one of the things that they told me is to look 2 or 3 cars ahead when I drive. Not at the car in front of me, but 2 or 3 cars ahead. I'm looking for what's happening a couple of cars ahead. That gives me time to react. So if the brakes are hit 2 or 3 cars ahead, if I wait till the car in front of me hits the brakes, sometimes that's too late. But if I'm watching down the road a bit, then I can react to what's happening far ahead because I'm looking forward. I'm looking up, I'm looking out, I'm looking forward. It's going on. Same thing applies to your plan. What's going to happen next week? And what could go wrong? One thing that is my voice in my project management head is what's going to go wrong and how can I resolve that? How can I fix it before it goes wrong? What do I need to put in place to make sure, do I need a plan B? What do I need to put in place to make sure everything goes smoothly? Always looking ahead because my people are looking at today. And they can only see today. And I don't really want to bother them about tomorrow, but somebody needs to be looking after tomorrow. And so that's the goal of this slide. So set a cadence with yourself as a project manager when you're working the plan and you're in the execution stage. My cadence is typically when I have to do a communication. I look at the whole plan, I kind of get, because at the end of the day I might have a lot of little, stickies and Post-its on my desk and lots of papers, but I want to clean all that stuff up, look at my plan, tidy everything up. That helps me really understand what's on task and what's not. And so every week I might do that, and I usually do that around a major meeting with a stakeholder or with my team. I like to, before my team, get everything tidy, create a little calendar for them, and I feel I know what's supposed to happen. I'm bringing in that vision of where they need to be in a couple of weeks, and so I want to communicate that to them. And if I don't have that vision of where they should be driving 3 cars ahead, then they're not going to get there because they're not going to have that vision either. So I need to bring that to them. And so that's what I mean by a cadence, is if I have a weekly meeting, then every week I'm pulling together and I'm looking ahead to see what's happening, and then I'm figuring out a way to communicate that to them. So I have a friend who likened this to vacuuming. So nobody likes to vacuum. When people come into your house, if you vacuum, they don't notice that you vacuumed. But they notice if you don't vacuum. So the idea is vacuum. For me, it's laundry. Keep up on your laundry, keep up on your vacuuming, keep up on your your project plan and how it's going and keep everything up to date, and that will keep things moving smoothly. And clearly communicate that out to your team. Here's where we're going in the next couple of weeks. Here's where you need to stay focused. That's part of your role as a project manager. And then lastly, create an environment for open communication and feedback. Again, we'll talk about communication here shortly, but the idea of creating a team where people are, remember, it takes a village. People are part of the process. People can give you feedback. People can say, I need this in order to be successful. I'm going to create that open environment with the team. So one slide on work the plan, and about 10 slides on what happens when things go wrong. So when things go off course, and they will. So we talked about the fact that you'll never have a 100% plan. You will also never have a plan for which everything goes perfect to plan. Something is going to go wrong because you just don't know the circumstances. Or you could have planned a volunteer project to paint a mural and it rains. Some things are just out of your control. So here we want to look at, well, what's going to go wrong in execute phase. And what's most important is not whether it goes wrong or not, but how you handle it and how you proceed with it. So that's what we want to talk about. So here's some things that could go wrong. Circumstances change. You have more accurate estimates. People thought it would take 10 days. Oh, now I really know it's going to take me 20 days. Well, what are we going to do about that? Resources drop out. Somebody gets sick. Somebody moves. Somebody's just no longer interested. Or all of a sudden now I've got multiple resources. I really want to be involved too. Can I accommodate that? How are we going to handle that in the plan? Scope is added. Dependencies change. There's a new discovery along the way. All of these things happen and execute, and it's how we handle that. So we make the best plan we possibly can. We talked about, well, when can you proceed? When we think it's the best to proceed and bring people on, and then now we figure out how to handle the changes. I talked about the Stephen Covey quote of having a destination. Well, one of the other comments that really stuck with me in the book was the fact that he writes about pilots. Now, pilots file a flight plan. How am I going to fly to LA? Pilots, 99% of the time, do not follow their flight plan. They have to adjust course based upon winds, based upon storms, based upon air traffic. So they take off thinking they're going to fly a certain way to get to LA. Then they might veer over here a little bit, and they go up a bit more and come down. They're constantly making adjustments along the way to land at that destination. And planes take off and land at their destination every day. And planes file flight plans every day. Planes rarely completely follow those flight plans. Same goes with your project plan. You're making the best plan that you possibly can, but no, things are going to go awry and you're going to have to readjust your plan along the way. And it's all about being flexible and looking for, as the project manager, looking for that 2 cars ahead unpredictability and being able to react to it and communicate. So let's look at that. So it's all about how you handle the turbulence, the deviations. Managing risks and issues. So when things are going off course, we talk about them in terms of risks and issues. So do you guys know the difference between a risk and an issue? Issue already happened. So a risk is something that may happen, and an issue is something that already happened. That's the difference. Thank you. So we talk about managing risks, like why manage a risk? It means planning ahead. It means looking 2 cars ahead. Seeing if you think something could happen and making it not happen as a result. We'll look more about that. So let's look at these items, one of my games again, to see if it's a risk or an issue. So the upcoming holiday vacation will delay the delivery date by 3 days. Issue. The cost may exceed the budget by $54. If we do not have 2 additional volunteers assigned by, we may encounter a slip of 2 days. Capacity of the conference room is 150, and we have 200 confirmations.
Issue.
And what's the key set of words there?
Is me.
Yes, may, is, will. You got it. Okay. So on risk. So the importance, like I said, of managing a risk is looking for what could go wrong and seeing if you can make sure that it doesn't go wrong before it happens. And looking ahead those 2 cars. And so what do you do? So at At the very beginning, when you initiate in your plan, I like to sit down with my teams and actually brainstorm risks. Again, it's what do you keep up with night? What are you worried about? What do you think could go wrong? And with that, you want to look at what's the impact if it goes wrong. Could, delay my project by a month. I could have to spend a lot more money. Or the impact could be, it could delay my project by a day. And look at the likelihood. How likely is that to happen? How likely is it that 10 of my volunteers will get sick? Not very likely. How likely is it that one will? Highly likely. So for each risk, I actually rate high impact, low impact, high likelihood, low likelihood. And that will better help me decide how much energy I put against solving that risk. If it's a high likelihood of happening, and it's a high impact on the project, I'm going to probably put some energy into that in order to see if that can not happen. So what I mean by that is the next set of bullets, create a mitigation strategy. If I don't put some energy in making that risk go away, then I want to look at, can I minimize the impact or likelihood? Is there something I can put in place to make the likelihood go from high to low, or the impact go from high to low? Some strategy. Maybe I hire an extra volunteer. If I think the likelihood that somebody's going to get sick, maybe I buffer and hire an extra volunteer, or bring in an extra volunteer in order to make that less likely to have an impact on the project. Or do you just accept and monitor it? Not very likely it's going to happen, or not high impact. Great, I'll just watch it and see if that changes, if it starts to be high likelihood of happening. Or just remove it altogether. That person's unreliable, it's a high risk that person is not going to show up on the day of, and so maybe we just ask them to not be a part of the project. We remove the risk completely. Does that make sense? So the idea of managing your risks proactively is to help minimize the number of issues you might have later on. You can wait for them to turn into issues, and maybe some of them would, maybe some of them wouldn't. And again, it's about deciding on how much energy you want to put to them. But if you put some energy in advance, you're going to put less energy in to mitigating a risk than you are in the flurry of an issue. Because when it's an issue and when it's happening, then it's drama, then it's flurry, then people are upset or nervous or concerned, and emotions get involved. If it's a risk, it's just a what-if situation. Maybe there's some things you can do. So I think it's a great exercise.
I guess I was just wondering, dealing with volunteers, you were saying it's better to plan to have, maybe a few extra if you're worried some people might flake out or be sick or not be there. But I mean, should you ever actually take a step to kind of remove or say, hey, I don't want you to really volunteer if it's,
If it's a volunteer, maybe not, right?
Well, right, that's kind
Yeah.
of, it seems like we're mostly dealing with volunteers. Now, if it's like,
Yeah.
what if it's a team member and you're on one or two, only one or two of the people on your team?
Yeah.
It's like, hey, how do I remove you?
Yeah, and maybe you
It's
can.
like an integral part.
Yeah, and in which case then you may say, I'm just going to have to accept that risk. And I'm going to have to deal with it and figure other ways to manage it accordingly. Because there's nothing you can do to really mitigate it that makes a lot of sense. And I think that's a fair comment because, yeah, go ahead.
I would just say with volunteers, I think that creating some sort of, you kind of want to plan for extras, but it's a balance between you want to have enough people that work gets done, but not too many people that it's like someone's bored or standing around. It's like the worst thing for a volunteer to be bored. So, which we'll talk about in volunteer management. But I think creating you can create some sort of maximum or some sort of, that way, like when you have to tell someone, oh no, you can't do that, or like I can't take you, it's not like I don't like you or I don't value your time, don't come. It's like actually, we actually have enough people, please come to this next thing or something. I think that there's ways to sort of remove them without it being like, a sticky situation or personal or anything like that, With volunteers it is a little harder, but you can, so you kind of have to create that barrier, and I think you sometimes have to take more risks that you might not have enough people and sort of be able to scale your work that needs to be done according to that with volunteers, but.
I think that's a great way to word it. Sometimes you just have to take on more risk.
Yeah.
And then if you have to do that, then you simply communicate that. This is the risk that we're accepting. We're accepting that we don't want to bring on volunteers who may get bored. And so, you know, as a team, if somebody gets sick, you may have to take on more work.
Yeah,
We accept
or-
that risk and everybody needs to buy into that.
Yeah.
And I think with risks, it's really important you're communicating what risks you're accepting, what risks exist in the project. In terms of risk, when it comes to, we were talking about risk in terms to timeline, the idea of having a timeline and there's risk that you may not know all the elements of the timeline, or you may discover items along the way because you have a research component. Using the idea of using risk, we accept that risk, or to mitigate that risk, you can let's move that research component up earlier or bring in an expert sooner to mitigate the risk. But looking at it in terms of a risk and what you want to do about that risk and how you want to communicate that risk. Yeah.
Do you ever ask your stakeholders, particularly in our case, the organizations, what they think would be possible issues, since they, you know perhaps more about it than we do?
I absolutely do. Both issues and risks. I ask them, you know, from an issue perspective, what do they know you're up against right now? Yeah. And then from a risk perspective, and what worries them.
Is that an initiation stage?
Yeah, because you're trying to scope out kind of the current state of affairs. And so sometimes you enter a project with known issues. And you have in your charter, you may say, here's my known issues and here's my known risks. And it's good to communicate that. Maybe you see them and the stakeholder doesn't. And it's good to communicate it so they know what they're getting into before you put too much work into creating a plan, or when you start to bring in resources and people, that everybody knows what they're getting into. It's to that transparency. All cards are on the table. We all know what we're getting into, and we still agree to move forward. There's something we haven't talked about, and I don't know if it comes up much in volunteer projects or not. It definitely doesn't work. It's the question of you start in the beginning and initiate, and you get all these risks and all these issues, and all of a sudden people are like, maybe I don't want to do that. And they shut the project down. And how do you feel as a project manager if they do that? And it's okay. So kind of what we tell people is, and I don't know, does that happen very often?
Sort of. One of our teams from the fall is actually hitting a lot of different, I guess, issues that they didn't really see what might be risks ahead of time, and are feeling very much like there's just no way it's going to happen. And they're the project managers, but in a way, like, I came in to talk to them about what could be done, and they very much hit that point of like, well, this is too much. These are too much of an issue, and we can't resolve it, and we're just going to have to back out. And I was kind of like, no, don't do that. And so I think that and that can happen. And there's really, ultimately, I kind of said to them, well, like, ultimately, you guys are volunteers, and if you do back out, you back out. It's difficult to. I don't have as much sway over it, but I think that the other good thing is that as a volunteer, if you do see these issues, to work around them, you have a little bit more. I think you have a little bit more leeway to try to get done what you can within those. So even if maybe you're so in my mind, you can kind of veer from the plan a little bit more because you're a volunteer, because you're not being paid to reach this end thing. If it ends up like, oh, well, this is an issue and we're not going to be able to do that, they can kind of say like, okay, but what can you do? And you can give them what you can. And most nonprofits are going to be open to receiving whatever it is that you can. And so that's kind of where the team that I'm working with now, we kind of ended up. I was like, all right, let's do what you can do, and then we'll see if those are still issues. Because sometimes it's just about doing something, and then those issues sort of start to seem less, I don't know, insurmountable. I guess.
Yeah, is it multiple issues
Yeah,
or just?
it's multiple things. Yeah.
You kind of can reach a stage where
dynamic.
you're like, this just doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
It's too much for the money. There's not enough value for what people are trying to achieve. That's possible. Or it's not good for the probably more like it's not the right thing for the organization. I'm a proponent of telling the organization that, but finding a nice way to do that. Like, we think this is the right thing for your organization. Now, I've had, as a consultant, the idea of my coming in to say, I think you should do this. They'd be like, no, I need to do that. Okay, fine. I think that's probably true of volunteer. As an organization goes, it's up to the organization. You may have a recommendation because you have a kind of a view into things, and they'd be like, no, I still want to do this. Okay, we'll give it the best shot. And then you may come up with so many issues that it's not possible. And what I was going to say is, don't feel bad as a project manager, because what you did is uncover that. And that's the part of it. So even if a project gets shuts down, if it's not the right thing for the organization to do, that's good. And you were able to uncover that sometimes sooner than later, as opposed to spending a lot of people's time and resources or money to do something that's not right for the organization. So always take into account, you're just trying to do what's right for the organization. And if it's not right, then it's okay to shut them down.
A matter of cutting your losses.
Yeah, and or I like what you said.
Personally
Or
and
finding
profitably.
another, and finding another way. You know, this isn't right, but we could probably do a couple of these things over here
Yeah.
and get some things done. So I've talked about it being initiate, plan, execute, close, but it may be initiate, plan, whoops, back to initiate again, initiate, plan, back to initiate, or back to plan. You could cycle back through as you discover along the way. Completely common, and probably really common in volunteer projects as you're trying to get people's time and information from people as well. So issues are things that are currently happening. So the biggest component of issues, I think, is for the project manager to remain calm. You are the face of the project, you are also the calm of the project. So when issues arise, people tend to get emotional. Oh my gosh, we have a problem, what are we gonna do? We'll never be able to solve it. And if you can come in with the calmness and guide the team to solution, again, remembering the weight of the world is not on your shoulders, you're working with whomever you're working with on your team, be it 3 of you, or 10, or 100 with volunteers, to come up with solutions. A lot of times I like to ask people for their input on solutions, as opposed to feel I have to solve it myself. I think we come up with better solutions sometimes. Multiple heads are better than one, as well as I feel like people are really bought into the solution. So bring in the calm. The idea of the 5 whys. 5 whys is, like, if somebody's really excited, you'd be like, well, why is that a problem? Well, because, it's falling apart. Well, why is it falling apart? Well, because so-and-so said, well, why did they say that? If you ask them kind of why 5 times to whomever is bringing you the issue, they will calm themselves down as they talk through it, and then get to a fact-based or an objective-based state in which you can then resolve. I think another way to state that is let somebody vent. Let them go through. If they're having a bit of emotion around an issue, let them vent for a little bit, help them through it, and then get to calm. And always look at your impact, your options, create an action plan, and resolve it. So when you have an issue, let them vent about it, create an action plan, communicate, and move on for every issue. Don't say it will resolve itself, even if the action plan is simply to communicate, hey, we've got this going on, and it'll be resolved by tomorrow. Always have an action plan on it, and each issue. Again, it's about looking a couple cards ahead when you're working your plan. You're also working your issues. Did this get resolved? Did this get resolved? Because they will fester, and they will come back to get you later on if you don't resolve them now. Make sense? Scope can be an issue. We've talked about this on several times. We've taught this course on volunteer projects. Your stakeholders are like, well, if we could just do this too. Oh, and while you're at it, could you add this? And I think that's really common because they have someone who can do some work for them. And let's add some more. This goes all the way back to the beginning when we talked about the project having a beginning and an end and being done. So scope in and of itself isn't a bad thing. It's just a matter of can you fit it into what you're trying to achieve. And if not, should it be another project? And so it's simply just talk through the scope item. Manage it consciously. I want you to, plant another tree. I'm back on my trees. Plant another tree. Well, let's see. Does that change my timeline? Maybe not. Okay, let's say. Does that change the number of people I need or the money I need? Maybe. I need to buy another tree. Okay, so I communicate that back with the stakeholder, and they're like, yeah, I still want to do that. Okay, fine. We will rearrange the project plan to account for that scope. So I've stated the impact. I've stated the impact on the timeline, the resources, and the budget. And then the stakeholder has given me the input to go forth. What you don't want to do is allow it to creep in. So you hear the phrase scope creep, and that's what it means. Is somebody's added a little one of these and something else, and the project's just kind of gone along and assumed that scope change, and all of a sudden you're missing your dates, and people are disappointed. So if somebody is asking, and a lot of times they didn't really realize they asked for something new. So it's up to you as a project manager to recognize, hey, I hear you're asking for something beyond what we agreed to in the initiate phase. Great, let's talk about that and see if that's appropriate now. It could have an impact on what we're doing, or if we need to do it a little bit later. So you really want to go through that very consciously with them and walk them through it. And sometimes establishing some guiding principles early on about what you're trying to achieve, that success criteria is probably the best example of that. If you each have in your write-ups, there's a success criteria, using that to say, does adding the scope compromise, are we going to be successful or not? And having people recognize early on and using that to help make that decision. Does that make sense? Okay. Before I go any further, I want to talk with the Mini Lights Foundation. Is it you? On what could go wrong and with your first 2 or 3 sentences on your project, and then what you could imagine, just imagine as a risk, what could go wrong, what you might mitigate.
Well, what it is taking at-risk youth and training and having them learn how to train animals, and to go out to the community and kind of show what their skills are as far as training dogs. Is that?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay, on what the risks might be? Well, for the people that are going to be sort of housing, I just a scenario to sort of put it into perspective. If the kids are maybe going to assisted living facility, that the people that are managing that facility might have some concerns about the children that are going there. You know, if their residents are going to be safe from the children, if the residents are going to be safe from the dogs. That's the kind of
Risk that you'd be dealing with. Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And have we heard from everybody now? Did we hear from your project as well? I'm trying to remember where I put them. Nope, we've got one more. And what time were we?
Oh, we're done at 9.
We're done at 9. Okay,
Yeah.
I want to make sure I'm
So I
respecting
mean, I
time.
only need like 10 minutes at the end.
Excellent, because I think the rest is pretty quick.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So that's execute. Any questions on execute? Execute is simply all about doing, looking for problems before they happen, recognizing them when they do, and communicating very clearly what you're doing about those problems. And it is probably the largest portion of your project, and usually the highest energy portion of your project.
Is it confusing to the project, or is it a stumbling block for the project to execute and have everybody involved in what the execution is and stuff? I mean, shouldn't we just pretty much take over and execute that project? I mean, how much input are we asking for from the stakeholders?
I think that it depends on the project, particularly with volunteer projects. Sometimes I think stakeholders probably don't have people to help you, and that's why they've brought you in. So it would be up to you to execute, and then you're just communicating, hey, I've got this issue or I've got this risk. Other times, think about it in terms of when you leave, who on their team needs to know about it, and if they can join you at some point and execute, that's really helpful, because that's a great transition plan of allowing them to.
Project to keep going.
It does, yeah, absolutely. And the other component of execute is if you're bringing in other volunteers to do the work, then you're guiding them along the way as well.
So when you talk about transparency, do you, like, when you just ask, like, how much do they want to be involved in the process, or how would that look? Just so you're not kind of reading what type of person they are, or how they, you know.
Yeah, I know, I think that's a great idea. It's like, do you want to be communicated with once a week, once a month? Do you want to know every issue, or, are they a detailed person, or are they high level? I think it's a great idea. Ask them for how they want to be kind of handled, so to speak. Yeah. It's simply remember that when you're done, to take time out and celebrate and thank everybody that was involved. Make a big deal out of what you've just accomplished. Be done. Put an exclamation point on it and say, we feel good. And if you're going to work with your stakeholder, and if you're going to work with any of the volunteers and or with each other again, one thing we recommend is sitting down and having a conversation around lessons learned. What went well? And always talk about what went well, because you want to repeat that. And what could we do different the next time? And that's part of the closed phase too, is just looking it back and saying, how do we feel about that? And would we do that again? And that's very helpful if you're going to do future projects together. If you're not going to do future projects together, maybe that's just an internal exercise. But if you are, then I think it's a good exercise for everybody to feel like we learned some things out of that, we feel really good, and as we work well together, we'll carry that stuff forward. So it's a good component. But always say thank you. I like to say thank you throughout the project. I make a big deal of people who have helped me out, because I always feel good about that. I think that's really nice. So that's it for close. Close is very short, but very important. And a lot of people, I would say a lot of people forget close. They just finish it and off they go. But take that extra time out to make a big deal of it. Okay, and then the last two sections I'm going to go through, this is the importance of communication and pitfalls, and they will go pretty quickly. I mentioned earlier the idea of communication is just something it's the difference between a successful project and not a successful project, is how you handle communication. And none of this should be anything that you haven't heard already, but at the same time, it's a good reminder in terms, and there's maybe some tidbits, hopefully, that we'll bring to you as well. The communication is the glue that holds it together as a project manager. That's one of the roles you bring, is to make sure communication is happening with your stakeholders, with each other, with your volunteers. Whomever is a part of your project, the communication is what you're bringing and you're looking for. And with this, if you remember the game of telephone, okay, I won't play it. I was going to make you guys play it, but I think we're conscious of time. But think of it, I mean, everybody's played that as a child, and that's exactly it. You have never played the game of
I
telephone?
have no idea, what do you guys think?
Really? Okay, we have to play. Okay, so I'm starting with you. Okay. So I'm going to tell Kathleen something, and she's going to tell each person and whisper it until the end. And then the last person, I want to have them say it out loud.
And you only get one child to hear it, right?
That's correct.
Right, okay. Okay.
Everybody in here playing something? Wow. Sounds too hard.
It's really long, I think I already messed it up.
Yeah, that's not very secretive. I might need that telephone again.
Sorry. I'm not like breathing here. All right. Sorry. So what you said, so you screwed it up.
He's like, oh shoot.
I felt a lot of pressure being the first person.
It's a lot shorter than it was.
Yeah, I know. I was gonna say it took like 2 minutes. Did you write down what it was officially?
Tomorrow, we're gonna meet at 10 a.m. and there's only gonna be 6 volunteers.
It did get a lot shorter.
I think that was my doing.
So it was tomorrow, we meet at 8 a.m. We expect 10 volunteers
I said 10, I'm sorry.
to arrive, but we'll only have 6. Yesterday, we had 5.
I messed up. I'm the one who said 10 a.m. We're all there 2 hours late. I'm sorry. I felt a lot of pressure being the first person.
Well, and I probably didn't do very well because I wasn't listening. I was giggling. He's like, oh shoot.
So that's telephone.
Well,
So that's
hilarious.
telephone. That's great that you haven't that's great that you hadn't played that before. So. But that, I mean, even as for several that played it as a child, even as an adult, it's a classic example of one, write it down, which I kept emphasizing because everybody, if I wrote that down on the board, everybody would have had the same message. No question, they've written it down on their pieces of paper. And also, watching for communication, because communication just gets messed up. That's just the way it is. People add their own color, hear something different, maybe need to hear it a few times before they get it accurate. And when that happens, people then move off course, or get upset, or have missed expectations. So the importance of the communication is on the project manager's shoulders to get that to be important in the project as a whole and to look for it. Because again, your task members or anybody who's working on the project is kind of heads down, and or your stakeholder is off doing 10 other things. But what you can do is focus on communication. And even when things are rough, good communication makes rough memorably good in the end. So I've been on rough projects, but if we all work together as a team and we communicated well, there's a good feeling at the end that we accomplished the right thing, even if we missed the date by a month. But a rough project is when people are mad at each other or upset, missed expectations, they're not talking to each other, not clearly communicating. That's when it's an unpleasant situation. So you're trying to avoid that communication. So communication, everybody knows it's important, but that doesn't make it easy, and it's easy to forget. So I actually put tasks on my project plan. Communicate to stakeholder at this point. Tell stakeholder this. I write it down so I don't forget it. And then part of that work the plan cadence, I think about who do I need to tell about what? And how do I need to tell them? What's the best way? Asking how they want to be communicated to. Is email the best way or is phone the best way? Thinking about when I want to send a message, how do I want to send that message? So I manage it as a task on my work plan, or I create a separate communication plan. It's fundamental to a well-functioning team. Think again back to the NASCAR pit stop. Those people don't talk to each other. They just do because they know what to do and they've communicated in advance, and they have a way of communicating prior to go working on the car because they don't have communication issues. They know what to do. And the goal is to enable listening in order to have common understanding. So it's not a one-way communication. It's not you, the project manager, telling. It's also listening and creating that constant feedback and communication throughout the team, not just you out. If that makes sense. You want to create an open communicating environment. So I like this comic. And then where it says, and that is why we lift on 3. Clearly, they did not communicate what it meant by 3. 1, 2, 3, 3, 2, 1, etc. Okay. My mantra is no surprises on my project. I don't want people to be surprised that something arose. I want them to have a heads up. So I do a lot of heads up communicating. This might happen. I'll check it out. I'll let you know. Or heads up. This is what's happening tomorrow. So what to communicate? Conversations, outcomes, expectations. We talked about an initiate to reflect back in a communication to your stakeholder what you heard. Thank you very much for giving me your time. This is what I heard from you, and here's my next steps. I think, do you guys do a lot of email with your stakeholders?
Yeah.
Yeah. So email, easy email back with a nice, pleasant, thank you so much. I look forward to our next meeting, reflecting back.
Sorry, can I just add on that
Yeah.
real quick? I've found that it's very valuable too after you meet with someone. Just had a lot of meetings this year, especially even with my own supervisors and coworkers. A lot of times we'll go to a meeting and we'll talk about ideas, and some people will be writing stuff down, some people won't, whatever. And at the end, I've always really liked it when usually my supervisor or someone after the meeting is like, okay guys, here's what I got from that meeting, and sort of writes out what they understood. And that way, when we all go back and we read it, we can say, okay, I got all that, but I also thought we were doing this, or I didn't think we were doing this at all. And that way it happens immediately before any of us act. Because I think a lot of times you get all this information, you're like, all right, and then you go, and you sort of forget to come back, and that's what she talked about that before, writing it down, actually what you said. But anytime you have a meeting, doing a follow-up that not only says thank you, but also says, okay, and here's what we talked about, just from what I understood. And I think that helps sort of nip any sort of communication errors or any sort of problems in the bud. Yeah.
It's like, this is not, I didn't sign
Yeah.
up for that. Yeah.
Exactly.
And I like to frame it in terms of what decisions do we make, what actions did we take away. You can do kind of here's the discussion we had. I kind of do that secondary. Clearly, here's what decisions we made. Decisions are really important to document because people are like, did we make that decision? I don't remember. And when they revisit the same conversation, like we had that conversation last week, weren't you? You were there. So I always document my decisions. Here's what decisions we made or assumptions we've made, and here's what actions I decided. Issues, risks, resolutions, and course alterations. As soon as you've got something that comes up, determine who needs to be communicated to. Again, maybe your stakeholder doesn't need to have every issue told to them. Maybe it's only the key highlighted ones. But determine if maybe it's just yourself you need to communicate to, but consciously ask yourself, who do you need to communicate to when there's a risk or an issue? Progress. I don't know what kind of progress you do for stakeholders. Sometimes it's nice to have a progress report that says, here's where we are, here's the accomplishments we've made to date, and here's our next steps. And that's another kind of communication. And celebrations and thank yous. Successes. Okay, I like that quote. The problem with communication is the illusion that it has occurred. Okay. How to communicate? Sure. Go through. So how to communicate, before I do that, this is where I wanted to ask explorations in math, whom you might communicate with. Which ones? Yeah. Who you might, well, 2 or 3 sentences on your project, and then who might you communicate with?
So our project is going to be, we're going to be working with explorations in math. I think they're an organization that have already organized math festivals for elementary school kids, and they kind of want to expand or bring in us to increase attendance to the festival itself and make a playbook, which is, we would give the playbook to other communities so they can do a math fest on their own. So organizing the entire festival becomes sort of repeatable.
Okay.
So that's our project. And we'll obviously have to communicate with explorations in math, people that have already been doing this. And maybe that's pretty much I can think of.
I would add that, so we need to communicate with our stakeholders directly, of course, but we're also going to be probably enrolling or enlisting volunteers to help us with certain aspects. So we'll also be communicating with them in conjunction with Explorations Mass. So they're aware, if we are communicating with volunteers directly, what we're saying to them, so that we're still, if we're doing stuff on behalf of Explorations Mass, we want to make sure that that communication is happening with their knowledge and they're aware of what's going on. And yeah, I'd say make sure that the communication is a two-way street, so we get feedback from not only volunteers, but stakeholders, anybody else who we're working with and coming in contact with.
Great, thank you. And I think it's a good exercise, and as you go through the project, just think about who you want to communicate with and how. Who is your stakeholder, who are the key people, and when do you communicate with them? Kind of categorize them accordingly. So how to communicate, choose the appropriate method. Is it email? Is it sometimes better to pick up the phone? Is it sometimes better to be face-to-face? Consciously choose that. And sometimes it's better to do both. Pick up the phone, and then hang up the phone, and type in an email. Here's what we just talked about. Sometimes that's very helpful as a reminder. Communicate more than you think necessary. Don't assume, game of telephone, don't assume they've got the message. Actually make sure you can't over-communicate, I think, and somebody can say, okay, you're giving me too much. You're like, oh, okay, I'm sorry, and asking about how to communicate. But communicate kind of in a message more than you think necessary. Don't assume they already know. Edit, and I have that several times. Always edit your communications. Be clear, concise, fact-based communication. Try to remove the adjectives and keep it to just what are the facts, just the facts, man. What are the facts in that communication process? Okay. Provide an avenue for two-way communication. Allow them, I always end my emails with if you have any questions or concerns, or if you walked away with a different understanding of the meeting, please let me know. I keep that door open for them to give me feedback back and let me know the communication. Sometimes I'll send an email and then I'll follow up with a phone call in a day or so. Just want to make sure you understood and if you had any questions. So again, another way of doing both. Use your gut, again, back to the art, kind of use your gut as to what's the right approach for communicating and how much is too much versus not enough. Don't forget face-to-face. In this one, when I say don't forget face-to-face, small meetings are sometimes best. It's a balance. Some people don't want too many meetings. But at the same time, sometimes I find on my job, I can sit behind my computer terminal and email all day long. But when I get up on my feet and walk to somebody's desk and talk to them and do that throughout the day, I find I have a much more productive and a much more satisfying day than just sitting at my terminal and sending emails out. So finding that right balance, and easy to email, I guess is what I'm trying to say here, but remembering sometimes it's better to pick up the phone and build that relationship.
When you're working with like 5 other people on a project as project managers, do you decide who communicates to the client?
Yes, and it goes back to that clear response. It's a great point, because it goes back to that clear roles and responsibilities. If you're working with 5 project managers, decide how you're going to divide up those tasks. Maybe one person is responsible for communications to the stakeholder, one person is responsible for meetings, one person is responsible for putting the plan together. That might not be the right division, but have a good conversation around who's going to do what, and having one person be kind of the face of the project is an important distinction to make. So that not everybody is hitting that stakeholder with different messages like the game of telephone, because then it gets really confusing. Be open to and listen to feedback. Consider the meeting before the meeting. Sometimes if you're going to have a meeting, making a phone call on a couple of the key people to see how they feel about the topic makes for a better meeting, simply because then you're coming in with more informed conversation, because you've kind of seeded in advance some of the conversation, as well as gotten the wheels to turn about the subject. So back to no surprises. If you have a meeting and people walk in cold and they're surprised by the topic, then that makes for a really rough meeting. Kind of give them a heads up with an email, or here's what we're going to talk about, or a phone call. By the way, tomorrow we're going to talk about a really tough subject. I want you to think about it. The meeting before the meeting is a really effective tool to have a great meeting with a lot of people who are involved. And it allows them to get through their little mini valley of despair. If you got an issue, kind of want to give them a heads up, let them get through the mini valley of despair so that they can start working on the problem. The rule of 3. The rule of 3 is simply if I send you an email, you send me an email back, and I send it back to you, now it's time to pick up the phone. Don't let our email chain go back and forth quite a bit. Go ahead and pick up the phone and talk through it. Rule of 7 is extreme, but simply think about when you are communicating that you want to communicate sometimes more than once. For 7, that goes with like rolling out a big giant project. You may have a banner, you may have an email, you may have a newsletter, you may have a billboard. You may have to hit an audience 7 different times for them to get the message, because they may not see the first one, or it may not digest the second one, or you're helping them get through that valley of despair. So particularly on launching a new way of doing things or a new thing to the community, having multiple communications is really helpful. And you may have in your project plan a communication plan about the item you're doing in terms of launching it toward the community. And that's when you would take that into account. Okay, gonna go faster speed. Okay. Whom to communicate to, I think we talked about that, but I think it was the question that you asked as well, which is asking people, how do they like to be communicated to? Looking for their styles. Some people like details, some people are analytical, some people don't, some people's schedules are just too busy. Some like emails, some like phone calls, some like meetings. Finding out if they have any special needs, and what's the best way to communicate with somebody. And think about each individual and how they're going to receive the message, not just what you're trying to send. So this gets back to status reporting, but the idea of communicating with your stakeholder, the idea of you have all this stuff, but you simply want to get to, when you're communicating status, you're communicating what are our successes, what are our critical path items that we're focused on, what are our key risks and our key asks. Our key asks What am I asking of the reader? If I'm sending a status report email to my stakeholder, well, do I need anything from them? And I should state that as well. Or do they communicate with you?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so status reporting with you would be key.
Yes, once a month, and I'll check in. I'll prompt it, don't worry.
Okay, so that's the idea of, you could get very colorful and very chatty. You want to be clear, concise, to the point with status email. Okay. Any other questions on communication? Okay. Lastly, some project pitfalls, things that could go wrong. So I'll go through this quickly. It's a little quiz for you all, and then we're done. Do you need to have all the answers at the start of the project?
Hopefully not.
Back to that overwhelming. Small
As much
chunks.
as I like to control it.
You're breaking your project into smaller pieces. Decide what you need to know right away and what you need to know later on. In creating a plan, it's important to know what you need to know and when you need to know it. You may not need it today, but I need it next Thursday. Then put an item on the plan that says, next Thursday, I will do this. Now I don't have to think about it for a whole week. Communicate the confidence factor and include key decision points in your plan. Those gates that we talked about. How much time before dinner is on the table? So who can tell me how much time before dinner is on the table in this kind of flow of chart? Where start is, I started to make my dinner, end is, I'm eating. And that's minutes, by the way, those numbers.
An hour and 50 minutes.
Hour and 50 minutes?
10 minutes.
Are you delegating any of this?
I'm not delegating any of this.
Okay, 2 hours.
An hour.
and 10.
Or do you, what is that? If they're minutes, that's 110 minutes, right? So the idea is critical path, and this is important when you're creating a plan. Know what's critical path and what's not critical path. By critical path, that means the top item. I can't mix for this particular situation, I can't mix until I'm done with prep. Mix is completely dependent upon prep. Cooking is completely dependent upon mix. Plating is completely dependent upon cooking. Those things must happen in cereal. Thank you. They must happen in a series, and one cannot happen before the other, and I cannot delegate and put two of them in parallel. Setting the table could happen at any point in time. So maybe I'm cooking for 60 minutes, sitting in the oven. I could go off and set the table. I could go off and set the table at any point I want there, but it must be done before eating. But it can happen in parallel. Lastly, clean. It's not dependent upon eating. I could do it after the fact. So when I counted critical path, I counted the top item, the longest item in the series. And that longest item was prep plus mix plus cook plus plate is 110 minutes. Now, if set the table was 120 minutes, then that was the longest item, and that would have been how long? So, make sense? So know your critical path and know what would delay. So this goes back to working the plan. Know what could disrupt your plan and know where to focus your energies. And focusing your energies on critical path at the time that it needs to happen, so it's key. And know what can be kind of like put to a side. I guess it's about prioritizing as well. When you look at your plan and you're working your plan, know, as a project manager, you're looking for you should know the priorities. You should know where the energy should be focused. And you should know what could kind of slide and still not disrupt your plan. And when you let something slide, when it needs to bubble back up to the top, because something can't slide forever. So you're kind of watching as to what needs energies, what needs attention, and when it needs it. Because sometimes it can't be everything all at one time. Should you load up your best resource? So I'm going to give you the answer to this one. So the idea of you've got one fabulous person on your team. Should you give them everything? Yes. A couple of things with this is no, because they might get sick. So I always like to have worked for a client who actually called their people bus people. That's a bus person. What does that mean? If they get hit by a bus, we're in trouble. So I like to make sure that you've got the work spread out such that if somebody does get sick, you can still proceed. the knowledge didn't walk out the door with you. You know what you're going to do. Sometimes it's not always possible, but it's a nice thing to consider. In addition, consider the fact that certainly for volunteer projects, this first line applies to work. Well, even at work, people don't work 40 hours a week. They go to the dentist, they need to go to the bank, they eat lunch, they talk to the cooler. For volunteer projects, much less, right? They're giving your time offline. They've got drive time, they'll be late. Recognize that when you're expecting 10 hours a week from somebody or 3 hours a week from somebody, you get 2.5 hours instead of 3, and kind of add buffer accordingly. What do you do with the naysayer? Do you guys know what a naysayer is? The complainer? Yeah. Eeyore, yes, exactly. So drama from a team member will stir up other team members. It's an unproductive spend, so you want to look out for it. It's up to the project manager again about keeping the team well-oiled, communicating well. You might have a naysayer. Oh, I don't know how we're going to do this. This is totally wrong. This is just never going to work. And so we talked about kind of the 5 whys. To let them vent. And I've had naysayers, and I've built a relationship where they can come to me and vent for a period of time. So I let them empty their emotional cup, and then take them to facts. And so I ask a lot of questions, letting them vent, but getting them to solution-based thinking. So I'm asking questions, well, what would you do about that? How would you solve the problem? And working them through it to get to the point where they can become productive. What you want to mostly do is make sure you remain calm. Emit calm. Stay objective. Stay fact-based. Ask for solution. Because if you get worked up into the emotions, the whole team will. If you can remain calm, that kind of emulates through the team, as well as brings the naysayer back to solution-based. They kind of need to vent for a little bit, and then get back to the reality of what needs to be done. And ask them for their own opinion on what their solution would be. Will this task ever be done? So something to look for simply is to say, you assign a task to somebody, and they're like, oh, I'm almost done. I'm almost done. Just another day, I'm almost done. That's a sign that the task is probably, they don't understand what the subtasks are, and it's probably not well understood how much work that they have to do. And if you find that to be the case, you've delegated something out, then it's okay to start asking them, well, what specifically do you need to do? And how much time do you think that little item would take? And what next do you need to do? And get them to talk out loud on their mini project plan. Because that will help them recognize how much time they actually have left. Because probably they don't have a good sense of estimating their tasks relative to time. So as a project manager, if you're delegating tasks out, you get to kind of dive a little bit deeper into what people are doing. Sometimes know when to dive in and know when to trust, but don't always trust. Is a small scope change okay?
Maybe.
Maybe. Maybe. We talked about it. We talked about the fact that you want to consciously manage scope. You also want to watch for it. It's easy to ask and accommodate for small changes, but be mindful, death by 1,000 cuts. So lots of small changes add up to one big giant one. Sometimes what's really helpful, and we didn't talk about this before, is if you're managing scope, and people get frustrated because they feel like, I've got you until July, and I'm going to lose you, so I better put everything on your plate. I better make sure I get as much as possible. Sometimes if there's another project or a bucket or a placeholder, or to say, I won't forget about this, and we'll take this back, and maybe we can work on this in the future, that gives them a way to say, okay, I don't have to worry about it right now. They feel that if they're not heard, if you're just saying no, but if you're saying maybe later, or let's talk about that next Tuesday, be like, okay, I'm okay with that. We sometimes refer to it as putting it on the parking lot. You put it to the side and say, I won't forget you, but let's not talk about that right now. It's a way to prioritize the conversation without them feeling like they haven't been heard. Parking lot is a nice tool, if you guys haven't heard of that before, to say, let's just put that in the parking lot and we'll come back to it later. And then I keep a parking lot list of things so they really do trust that I won't forget the topic. And for scope, I said maybe. If it's truly important, remember to communicate and manage it. What's the impact and how you're going to get it done. It's okay. Project plans are changing as long as it's a conscious change that everybody agrees to. And so you're not missing expectations. Did we really talk about that last week? This is documenting decisions. We talked about about that briefly before, which is sometimes it's helpful to really document decisions because sometimes people forget that they've already had the conversation, or they really want to revisit a decision. And you're like, we already talked about that, we decided on this, and so you can keep the team moving forward. Is it okay to squeeze the dress rehearsal when running late? So we haven't really talked about dress rehearsal, but the idea in execute is at, like right before you want to roll something out. So if you take the volunteer project of painting a mural, right? Maybe you want to walk through on paper. Tomorrow we're going to paint a mural, so let's walk through. You're going to go get the paint. You're going to hand out the paint brushes. You walk through on paper. That's kind of a dress rehearsal in the case of a volunteer project. So the question is it okay? Uh-oh, we're running late. I need every last little minute.
Maybe.
Maybe. It definitely occurs. It's easy to say, oh, it'll go well tomorrow. Don't worry about it. It's easy to trust. One thing I find is to set some mini milestones, mini go, no-go decisions along the way, mini dress rehearsals, if it's appropriate to your project. Sometimes it's helpful just to do it on paper in the morning, right before you actually execute. So finding a way to I think it's helpful to do a walkthrough on paper before you actually roll out a particular project, simply because it makes people think about the tasks in more detail. Kind of makes the walk through that plan that last time. Why don't they like what we did? In this case, sometimes projects, we talked about this earlier, sometimes projects, they don't like it, or they change their mind, or it's not working well, and you may need to redirect the project, and that's okay, or not do the project. In this case, this goes back to having the case where you do initiate, and then you deliver on initiate, and it missed expectations. It goes back to initiate. Making sure your initiate phase is really strong about setting expectations about what you're going to achieve, what success looks like, what your boundary conditions are, so that you can meet expectations. Spending time in initiate will better help you prepare for them liking what you do in the end. As well as communication along the way. Again, managing expectations, no surprises. And lastly, recognizing you want to manage change throughout the process. Any questions on that?
Even though it's always evolving, do you give a copy of your business plan to your client?
The business plan or the project plan?
Sorry.
That's okay.
Obviously, what's on my mind. The plan,
The project plan.
Yeah.
Yes, with a date on it.
Okay. so
Draft version, like I'll say version April, 19th, 2011. So they know specifically what date is on it. And that's why I also maybe put decision points on my project plan. Need to decide on this by this point, or need to create plan for this item by this point. So they know that I don't have that plan yet, but I will by that date. So the plan for the plan, I put that on my plan as well. Sometimes what I also do is I create two plans, my very detailed one, and then a higher level version of the plan, maybe a pretty one for the stakeholder. And that's what I share with them because they don't want the details. Or I do a visual calendar, it's just, and write in the kind of key milestones for them that way. Sometimes that's finding that right communication tool with them is nice. And lastly, why shouldn't I wait until a risk is an issue before solving? You're all clear on the value of working risks? You don't think you'll go have some risk brainstorm meeting? Less drama, the better. Exactly. That real mantra. Okay. That's all the information I have. You guys have any last questions or items that you would want to share?